So overjoyed to step into the room this morning and see it's called the Fibonacci room. I didn't even notice that. So this is a good room for us today. Free and secure, the compatibility of heavenly freedom and eternal security. Christian philosophers have argued that in order to avoid the possibility of sin, the redeemed in heaven will not have the freedom to sin. Augustine, for instance, argues that creatures, human or angel, who enjoy the beatific vision are not able to sin. Sennett agrees it cannot be possible for there to be evil in heaven, but offers an alternative account for why heavenly occupants, particularly the redeemed, cannot sin. He maintains that by exercising their free will on earth, humans develop characters which limit their future actions. In particular, the redeemed in heaven will have freely formed moral characters that are not capable of choosing that which is morally evil. This then, quote, allows that the good manifested by libertarian freedom to be present in heaven, even though there is no libertarian freedom there. Paul and Tempe similarly maintain that in heaven, the blessed will be incapable of willing any sin, just as we are incapable of willing a particular sin of torturing an innocent child for a nickel. We will refer to these two explanations for why the redeemed cannot sin in heaven as the heavenly atmosphere view and the formed character view. Few have instead taken the position that the redeemed are still free to sin in heaven. Such a view may have been held by Origen. More contemporarily, Donnelly has argued that freedom, including the freedom to sin, is essential to the Christian understanding of heaven, and to think that when one attains heaven, due to the achievement of some degree of moral perfection, one no longer needs to be free, is to misunderstand the Christian notion of heaven. Donnelly concludes that the redeemed are at risk of future eviction from heaven. Yet, McPherson warns that the freedom to sin in heaven would mean that God's creation is always at risk, and there is an eternal question mark over God's solution to the problem of evil, and thus God's victory is always provisional. I argue that libertarian freedom to sin or not sin can be consistent with eternal security against sin. I call this the free and secure framework, which maintains the following three premises. Premise one, in eternity, free creatures will have the power to sin or not sin. Two, God foreknows that in eternity, no free creature will sin. Three, therefore, in eternity, no free creature will sin. Some may see that the creaturely freedom of one and definite foreknowledge of two are incompatible, but I do not engage in that debate, treating them as compatible. Since God is classically understood as having only in all true beliefs, if God foreknows X will occur, then X will occur, hence 2 entails 3. Yet 3 asserts that it's a mere contingent fact, not a metaphysical necessity, that no creature will sin. Thus, 3's claim that no free creature will sin avoids contradicting the freedom claim of 1. To motivate the free and secure framework, I offer 3 objections against the heavenly atmosphere and form character restrictions on morally significant freedom in heaven. Then I discuss the role of foreknowledge and how God might providently ensure 3 without compromising 1. First objection. Rejecting that the redeemed will be free to sin in heaven undermines the classical free will defense. Recall that in his formulation of the problem of evil, Mackey proposed that God could have avoided the possibility of evil by creating a world of free creatures who always freely chose the good. While he was correct in observing that such a state of affairs is possible, creatures always freely choosing the good, Plantinga's free will defense succeeded against Mackey by arguing that the alternative possibility of choosing evil is an essential property of freely choosing good, and therefore the possibility of evil is a necessary concomitant of morally free creatures. Plantinga argues that such moral freedom is a significant good that justifies God creating a world that includes the possibility of evil. Thus, if one maintains that creatures do not have the freedom to sin in heaven, then it draws into question why one should think that such freedom would have been of such significant value in this world to justify the possibility of evil. Martin has raised this objection, as have Nagasaga, Api, and Tokarkis, who argue if human beings have severely limited freedom of action in heaven, then there is at least some reason to think that morally significant freedom of action cannot be an overwhelmingly weighty good. Moreover, they pose the problem. If there can be an abundance of goods without freedom or evil, then what justification could a perfect being have for making a universe like ours? To overcome such objections, one may argue that it is the good of libertarian free will on earth that makes possible the goods of heaven, affording creatures the opportunity to develop moral characters that are incapable of choosing evil. This is precisely what Sennett argues when he states, if there is to be an essentially evil-free heaven at all, there must be a pre-heaven segment of the same world containing the possibility of evil. Yet, Nagasawa, Oppi, and Tarkakis raise the formal objections to Sennett's view. First, they note that it does not appear to be the case that people form characters in this life that would make it impossible for them to choose sin in heaven, as good as Grandma is. To this, Sennett suggests that God supplies upon our deaths whatever is lacking in our character formations to bring us to the state of compatibilist free perfection. However, they judge such a response inadequate, for if God is able to develop our characters to the point of perfect obedience, then God could have just given us those characters that determine that we always do the good. But then God could have created humanity with developed characters initially, so that no one would ever sin, as Mackey had proposed, undermining the free will defense. The free and secure view does not suffer from this difficulty. It affirms with Mackey that if there is there is no logical impossibility in man's freely choosing the good on one or on several occasions, hence there cannot be a logical impossibility in him freely choosing the good on every occasion. Yet it also maintains, in agreement with Plantinga, that the possibility of choosing moral evil is a necessary concomitant of the freedom to choose moral good, thus it leaves the free will defense intact. Objection 2. Before giving the second objection against limiting heavenly freedom, I note the cosmic scope of Scripture's vision of a new heaven and new earth, where there would be no more sin, but only righteousness. Therefore, rather than restrict the present discussion of freedom and security to merely angels or the redeemed in heaven, in light of the cosmic nature of the eschatological vision, one may seek to address how creatures throughout all of creation can be morally free throughout eternity without sinning. In particular, just as Sennett describes heaven as a place in which evil is completely eradicated, one may extend this characterization to all of new creation. This cosmic formulation of the dilemma, however, poses a problem for any view that maintains that newly created creatures must first experience a probationary period when they can sin or not sin before entering the conditions or forming the character that makes them incapable of sinning. For if that is the case, then if God were to create morally free creatures in the future, be it through a special act of creation or through human procreation, they too will be required to experience a probationary period when they can sin or not sin, threatening eternal security. Thus, to preserve eternal security, one must either argue why future free creatures would not require such a probationary period, raising the thorny theodicy questions above of why humanity did, or one must deny the possibility of God creating future free creatures to safeguard eternal security against sin. Yet to deny the possibility that God would create future free creatures is highly speculative, and would require imposing a significant constraint on God as creator. Third objection. Third, canonical reading of the fall of Satan appears incompatible with the formed character of heavenly atmosphere limitations on heavenly freedom. Classically, Christians have understood the first sin to have occurred in Lucifer's angelic rebellion, as described, at least typologically, in Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28. Augustine maintained that Lucifer and the angels fell while not enjoying the beatific vision, during which they would have been able to sin. It fell not during the beatific vision, during which they would not have been able to sin, but during a probationary state when they were first created and able to sin. Similarly, Aquinas stressed the devil, with his companions, sinned immediately after creation. Thus, they sought to preserve the assurance of security against sin for those who experience the beatific vision. Notable features of the biblical text, however, suggest an exalted period of heavenly service by Lucifer prior to his fall. The use of the sanctuary title of covenant cherub places Lucifer prior to his rebellion next to the very throne of God, in the highest creaturely office. Indeed, he is described as being adorned with jewels, such as on the breastplate of the Israelite high priest, suggesting his cultic function in the heavenly temple. It is hard to maintain that one who served in such a role in the immediate presence of God's throne would not experience something akin to the beatific vision, calling into question the view that the heavenly atmosphere is sufficient to keep a creature from sinning. Moreover, the description of the cherub as perfect and blameless in your ways indicates he was morally developed. Yet the passage also suggests that Lucifer's fall was made possible by a period of growing pride that deformed his character to the point that he was willing to make open rebellion against God. If it is possible for a morally developed character to be deformed to the point of great evil, then this undermines formed character accounts of heavenly security, for it leaves open the possibility that a similar deformation of character may happen to the redeemed. As Wall expresses it, as long as the inhabitants of heaven remain free, does not reversal of character remain a possibility? Thus, while character development may play an important explanatory role in why eternity will be free from sin, it is not sufficient to safeguard against the possibility of sin. Now for a discussion of foreknowledge. Rice expresses the concern: if sin is essentially an act of perversity, then we can identify Lucifer's rebellion. But we have no guarantee that some other being will not make an irrational, wholly unjustified decision to rebel against God in the future. For the free and secure framework, while such a future rebellion remains a metaphysical possibility, the perfect reliability of God's foreknowledge that no free creature will rebel serves as the guarantee that it will not happen. As Macpherson writes, God foreknew that the great controversy will be eternally successful. Of course, as an open theist, Rice is unable to appeal to definite exhaustive foreknowledge. Thus, to have certainty that sin will not arise again, the open theist denies that in eternity, creatures will have the freedom to both sin and not sin. Boyd takes this position when he argues, while we cannot make sense of the genuineness of the war without affirming the irrevocability of morally responsible freedom, we cannot make sense of the certainty of God's ultimate victory in this war without supposing that this irrevocability is finite. In particular, Boyd believes it is necessary to limit libertarian freedom to this world in order to provide a plausible explanation of how it is that the possibility of love entails risk without holding that heaven will be eternally risky. Rice echoes Boyd's view, asserting that the freedom God grants creatures is both limited in scope and duration, only to this world. But Helseth argues that this is a fatal move for the open theist, for limiting the freedom of creatures in heaven jettisons the coherence of the openness program, since it establishes that God cannot accomplish his ultimate purpose without violating a significant component of that purpose. This puts the open theist in an awkward position, having to severely limit libertarian freedom or risk the eternal security of the cosmos. Nevertheless, while foreknowledge provides a guarantee of eternal security, it cannot fully account for it, as foreknowledge is logically dependent on the future free will decisions of creatures rather than the other way around. Therefore, one might ask, by foreknowing there will not be another future fall, does God just get incredibly lucky? In particular, as no reason can be given for the first sin other than the free decision to sin, if in eternity there will be the possibility of sin, what accounts for why the redeemed or other future free creatures will not inexplicably choose to sin? I suggest that the inexplicability of sin, in fact, helps to explain why future free creatures will not choose to sin. To see this, suppose Lucifer had not sinned. In such a world, Lucifer could have possibly sinned, yet his conditions, heavenly atmosphere, foreign moral character, and good reasons not to sin, including the inherent irrationality of sin, would have been sufficient to explain why Lucifer did not sin. Yet similar conditions and good reasons will exist for the future free creatures to not sin. Thus, there is no more difficulty in explaining why future free creatures will not sin than there would be in explaining why Lucifer had not sinned had he not sinned. One may object, though, that those conditions and good reasons not to sin were also available to Lucifer in this world where he did sin. Thus, the existence of good conditions or reasons is not sufficient to ensure a creature will not sin. But it is the nature of a libertarian free action to be undetermined. Thus, if anything is to constitute an explanation for a free action, other than the free action itself, it cannot have necessitated that action, else the action would not have been free. Hence, we can accept heavenly atmosphere, form character, the illogical nature of sin, the good reasons not to sin, all contribute to an explanation for why free creatures will not sin, even while those do not necessitate that free creatures cannot sin. In light of this analysis, it is plausible that there exist at least some feasible worlds where in future eternity, free creatures will freely not sin. However, given that a fall occurred despite good reasons, one might also expect that in at least some possible worlds, future free creatures will sin. The question then becomes, what ensures that the future of this world is sin-free? An appeal to foreknowledge alone appears unsatisfactory, for, as Hasker has argued, simple foreknowledge gives God rather limited providential control. Thus, we append to the free and secure framework the following proposition. 4. God ensures a sin-free future via middle knowledge, providentially acting through the plan of redemption to ensure that in eternity, no free creature will sin. Here, middle knowledge refers to God's knowledge of what all possible creatures would freely do in any given circumstance, also called counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. In particular, it may be the case that there are some future free creatures who would freely sin if they merely had the same conditions and reasons not to sin as were available to Lucifer, but would not freely sin if something more was provided to them. The demonstration in the plan of redemption of the destructive nature of sin, in contrast to the trustworthiness of God, may serve as that something more. Under this view, God may have had several ways of bringing about human salvation, but God, exercising his knowledge of the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, enacted a plan that provided a sufficient demonstration of the destructive nature of sin and of God's character, so as to ensure that no free creature would ever sin again. As Macpherson argues, God allows things to go on as long as needed to comprehensively answer all questions of the great controversy in such a way that evil and the war will never rise again, that and no more. One may object that if sin is already inexplicable, then no additional revelation of its destructive nature would further deter one against it. But this doesn't seem right. If a stranger offered you $1 to destroy your new car, it would be inexplicable for you to agree. Yet if it were revealed that the stranger had the malicious intent of destroying your car by driving it into a playground full of children, then this additional revelation would further deter one from selling it to the stranger. God may be providentially guiding history via his knowledge of the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, ensuring the nature of evil and God's love are sufficiently evident so that all future free creatures are adequately deterred against any future sin. If so, this would have significant implications for the evidentiary problem of evil. Now, one might object that if there is a feasible world timeline where future free creatures will freely not sin, should there not have also been an entire such timeline available to God so that sin never arose in the first place? After all, could God not have, via his knowledge of the counterfactual of creaturely freedom, provided whatever additional evidence was needed so that Lucifer would not have freely chosen to sin? While this objection warrants further attention, I will here just suggest that it may be the case that there was no such feasible timeline free from sin that also contained the goods of God, the goods God desired of creation. Yet, given the rise of the first sin, God was able to use it as occasion to provide a demonstration that could not have been given prior that serves to safeguard future free creatures from sinning. Should God have such middle knowledge, then the eternal safety of the cosmos does not require revoking the freedom to sin or not sin. Rather, the all-wise God can providentially guide history to a state of eternal security where creatures enjoy the good of moral freedom, yet always freely exercise the good. You always freely exercise it for the good. The atmosphere of heaven, the formed characters of the redeemed, as well as the historical record of how God defeated sin through self-sacrificial love, all provide an abundance of reasons to help explain why none will choose to sin, even as it remains a metaphysical possibility. That guarantee that sin will not rise a second time. Instead, rest in God's sure foreknowledge that the future is secure. Thus, in the assurance of his eternal security, creation can freely rejoice. To the only wise God, our Savior, be glory and majesty, dominion and power, now and forever. Amen.
Right on time. Good. So, all right. So, thank you for a very intriguing paper, and it's a very interesting use of the middle knowledge idea. Molina and explored that, and I'm wondering if relying on meta knowledge in that way, does it turn God into a determinist in some way? In other words, he sees all possible futures and decides which one we're going to have. Is there a slippery slope into determinism here in some way? I don't know.
I'll say two things. First of all, you don't have to accept the entire Molinist package in order to just have God having knowledge of the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. So Molinism has to do with God surveying the possible feasible worlds prior to the creative decree. And I'm agnostic about that, make no claims about that. I'm just say here, once there is a creative decree in this world, if you accept that God has this knowledge of the counterfactual of creaturely freedom, then God could use it. Now, is that thwarting on determinism? I don't think so. It's God knowing what you would do in some given circumstance, and then what future free creatures would do. It's not God determining what you would do.
You're not arguing for an exhaustive middle knowledge.
Yeah, and I'm not arguing for the entire Molin. So, Molinism has challenges. It's grounding objection. There's various objections that one may or may not find compelling. You don't have to have prior to the creative decree, God having this knowledge. But once the creative decree is given, once we're in the column of evil, at this moment, that's the only moment I'm invoking this middle knowledge. So it's a smaller cell than the entire moment's knowledge.
Thank you, Anthony, for a paper that is full of neat analytical logic. But its value for me is somewhat limited by three significant presuppositions that it seems like you are working with. And one of them is the sort of the validity of a rather traditionalist view of biblical images. The second one is that you presuppose, contra Rice, a rather Calvinistic-like view of God, at least God's omniscience in regard to the future. And then third, and perhaps most problematic for me, is it seems to presuppose a rather traditional worldview, which is increasingly suspect in light of the burgeoning of knowledge of the cosmos, illustrated best by these two physicists who 2 years ago got the Nobel Prize for their work in quantum mechanics, the quantum entanglement. Doesn't that, I won't ask you a rhetorical question, that causes me real pause when it comes to making the sort of confident reasoning that I hear you engaged in.
to the concern that I'm too confident, there were a whole lot of maze, especially as the paper progressed. So what I see this as exercise in is not an insertion in this is how it is, but a series of if-then relations, right? If you accept this reading of the Lucifer, of the fall of Lucifer, as many would, then here's what follows from it. And individually, you may have reasons why you find that compelling or you don't find that compelling, right? What came out of this for me was this interesting interplay between foreknowledge and freedom. And what it seems like in relation to the Openness Project is those who were attracted to open theism were many times attracted to it because of their concern that foreknowledge limited free will. There was this real concern. Now, one can analyze his arguments, maybe think those compelling or not. But the great irony is that in rejecting foreknowledge, they find themselves having to limit free will for eternity. And so I think there's a great irony this is bringing out in whatever your view is, and if foreknowledge is true of free will, it's maybe pointing out the tension you felt went one way, maybe actually goes the other way. Maybe it's the rejection of foreknowledge, which is a bigger compromise to free will than the affirmation of foreknowledge.
Thank you for your conversation.
Yeah.
As you noted near the beginning of the paper, there are certain Christian thinkers who posit a form of compatibilism in order to explain creatures being free in heaven or secure in heaven. Now, I wondered if you could elaborate on why you find such a form of compatibilism insufficient, specifically with regards to theodistical problems. So you assert your paper relies on Alvin Flanagan's free will defense of towards the problem of evil, which is based upon a libertarian understanding. But could we not, in order to answer those theodistical issues under compatibilism, posit a form of, for example, a soul-building theodicy, I mean, where where creatures are compatibilistically determined to develop souls through this life towards heaven, and then appeal to the standard standard soul building assertion that building souls on Earth provides some form of greater good than just fully formed characters since the beginning. So could you elaborate on why you would find this compatibilistic understanding to be insufficient or inadequate?
Yeah, so just briefly, let me chat more afterwards. When I raise objections, I don't see objections as defeaters. I see objections as showing the cost of maintaining a view. And so I'm saying that one cost of maintaining that view is it may compromise the free will defense, and you may not want to give that up, right? So this is making it more expensive for you to hold on to one of these views. If you think that it's something you want to hold on to. If you're okay giving up Plantinga's free will defense, then maybe the first objection will be less expensive for you. That doesn't seem to deter you. But then that's where I point to the second and third one. Future free creatures. Do you want to limit God's ability to create future free creatures? Or do you believe that every future free creature would also have to go through a probationary period where there could be future instances of sin? And maybe then you will just say, there can be future instances of sin, but then I would ask, is that compatible with this eschatological vision of God prevailing over sin? Or is that limited to just in this world, in this context? So I'm just trying to tease out, you can accept these other positions, but there was some cost associated with them.
Thank you so much for what was a great paper. A great paper is one that gets us to think and converse and to really delve deeper into an issue, and this paper has clearly done that very well. I'm not going to really critique anything. One of the assumptions, though, that you're working with, of course, is that there is no more sin. And I just wanted to bring into conversation into that. I have a paper coming out in Oxford's Journal of Theological Studies looking at Enoch's influence on Revelation. And one of the texts in Enoch is the dream visions of Enoch, and specifically the animal apocalypse. And the animal apocalypse is almost identically like what we find in Revelation 19 to 21 in structure, order, sequence of events. But you also then notice how John of Patmos takes it in different directions at specific points. But when you do, you notice one thing, which is it may be incorrect how we're reading Revelation when it says nothing unclean will enter into the city. Often the assumption means there will not be sinners. But in the animal apocalypse, which John is editing here, you could argue, or drawing on the tradition, there are. The Gentiles are considered to be sinners, and they're considered to live outside of Jerusalem. And the question they have in the animal apocalypse is, well, how will they eventually stop causing us to be afraid so that, Micah's prophecy can come true that everyone has their land and isn't afraid anymore? So they come up with the idea of what they call the white bull, who will basically frighten them all into submission. At exactly that part of John's narrative, he switches a Gentile leader, white bull character to the tree of life will have the leaves for the healing of the nations. Now, both texts then seem to presume there is a process of development. It is not that you, in their minds, in their early visions, that you just immediately transform, but rather there is a transformation process. And we see this even in another part of Enoch, in the Apocalypse of Weeks, where there's an entire week period for a transition to occur. So I wonder to what degree our assumptions about no sin in heaven are out of alignment with some of the more earlier takes that form the tradition in terms of their expectations. Again, this is more of a comment. You may not have anything to say to it, but just something I thought worth for our imaginations.
Yeah, just to conclude, my burden in this paper wasn't to argue for eternal security, but was just to argue that heavenly freedom can be compatible with eternal security. So I made no arguments in that direction. I would say briefly, in this I made many references to something being supplied, maybe an intermediary state. Some would see a role for purgatory for doing something like this. We have the Millennium Navins theology that maybe there's some work there that could be done of what is the Millennium doing. I think there's some interesting possibilities there, but I made no effort to engage that in this paper.
Oh, there's 3 more after Marina. I think this is the last one we'll have. Sorry.
Don't go.
Not yet.
Still watching.
Thank you so much for this paper. I am a big fan. I'm going to use this. It's great application for the knowledge and to thought out these kind of logical questions rather than just problem suffering. Very creative. I love it. My question is piggybacking off of Nick Miller's because you said that while you're using sort of a part of Molinism, not entirely. But I'm wondering, so at the conclusion of your paper, you say that God sort of serves as a guide in history to a state of eternal security. And I would love if you could elaborate on what's the difference then between sort of this guidance and the choosing that would be required of a more Molinistic theory. So if God is guiding, isn't he in some way choosing a particular end to which he's aiming toward, or yeah.
It's really hard because it's what is the something more that has to be supplied so that it's not clear. It may be the case that sin is so inexplicable that in the vast majority of feasible futures, no free creature will sin. That may be the case. Maybe God doesn't do very much at all, right? But it's not clear how dense that. So is it like 1%? Is it 99%? But I think this is where these questions of, well, why has the plan of salvation played out so long? There may be some real promise here, right? Like this problem of the issue of the problem of evil. Why has God allowed this demonstration to go on so long? Why has God allowed the world to get so bad? It's possible that some of that may be God allowing these things to play out, knowing that this will be the something more. And that prevents any future rebellion that could be infinitely worse, right? So this is where I'm very cautious to speculate and putting hard positions, lots of maze in that paragraph. But it comes down to your view on what is the something more needed. And it's God allowing things to play out in adequate amount of time, God demonstrating his love in the way that he has. I think that's what I would point to. It's not God forcing the free will decisions of anyone. It's actually allows God to preserve the free will choices
And I
of
don't
all.
think Mormonism
Right,
does that.
right.
So
I don't think so.